To think about who I was before I knew who I was. That sounds like something you'd stitch onto a pillow, but I mean it literally. Before March of last year, I had a whole life built on a foundation I thought was solid. I had a name. I had a face I recognized in the mirror. I had an aunt who raised me, a bedroom in her house in Tulsa I'd slept in since I was 7 years old, and a story about where I came from that I'd repeated so many times I'd stopped questioning it. My name is Audrey. I'm 29 years old, and for 28 of those years, I had no idea I wasn't who anyone said I was. My aunt. I'll call her my aunt, because that's what she told me she was. Her name is Roberta. She's a careful woman, the kind who measures twice before saying anything, who keeps receipts for purchases she made in 2009, who never raises her voice because she doesn't need to. She has a way of making you feel small without ever technically doing anything wrong. When I was a child, I thought this was just what adults were like. When I was a teenager, I thought it was just her. By the time I was in my 20s, I had stopped thinking about it at all. Because that's what you do. You adapt. You normalize. You stop asking why you feel like a guest in your own home. She never called me a burden directly. I want to be fair about that. She never sat me down and said the words. But she said things like, "You know this wasn't what I planned, and I gave up a lot to take you in." And my personal favorite, which she said at least a dozen times over the years, "Some people don't get to choose their circumstances, Audrey. That includes me." She said it the way people say things they want you to carry, not for your own good, but for theirs. I carried it. I carried it through high school, through a nursing program at a state school in Oklahoma, through my first job at a pediatric clinic in Tulsa, through 2 apartments and one serious relationship that ended partly because, as my ex put it, I had trouble believing I deserved to take up space. I don't think he meant it unkindly. I think he was right. My parents, according to Roberta, died in a car accident when I was 6. That's what she told me. My mom was her younger sister. My dad had no family worth mentioning. There were no photos. She said the fire in her previous house took most of them, along with a lot of other things she didn't like to talk about. I accepted this the way children accept everything that comes from adults, completely and without receipts. I never did a DNA ancestry test. It wasn't something I'd thought much about, honestly. Those kits always seemed like something people did when they were bored or curious or wanted to find out they were 3% Scandinavian. I had other things to think about. I had 12-hour shifts and a lease renewal and a cat named Biscuit who required more emotional attention than most people I knew. The test wasn't even mine. This is the part that still makes me stop when I think about it. The whole thing started because of a little boy named Tommy who was 8 years old and came into our clinic every few months for monitoring related to a rare blood condition. He was the kind of kid who narrated everything he was doing in real time. Now I'm sitting down, now I'm looking at the ceiling tiles, that one looks like a duck. And I loved him unreasonably, the way you love the kids who remind you of yourself. His mom had submitted a saliva sample to one of the big ancestry databases as part of a broader genetic screening her specialist had recommended, cross-referencing for potential hereditary markers. It was a long shot. Standard procedure in cases like his. Our clinic had a partnership with a regional genetic counseling center, and sometimes results would come back through our system before the family had a chance to review them through the main portal. That's how I ended up looking at a screen with Tommy's results pulled up on a Tuesday afternoon in March with nobody else in the room. His results were fine, completely fine. I noted what I needed to note and was about to close the tab when the system flagged a secondary match, a close, genetic relative in the database who had submitted their own sample. The database had a consent-based relative matching feature. Most people don't read the fine print when they sign up for these things, but occasionally the system surfaces a significant match. The flag said, "Potential first-degree relative match identified." and the name attached to the profile was mine. I remember the exact sound of the air conditioning in that moment. I remember the specific weight of my own hands. I looked at the screen for what felt like a long time. Then I looked at it again. My name, my sample, which I had submitted 8 months earlier as part of a clinic wellness initiative, something about understanding genetic predispositions in healthcare workers, matched as a first-degree relative to Tommy's mother. Tommy's mother, whose maiden name was Patricia Holloway Ney Vasquez, who was 44 years old, who grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had never been to North Carolina in my life. I had never heard the name Vasquez in any context related to my family. Roberta's family was from Kansas. We were, she'd always said, a very boring Midwestern family with no interesting branches. I closed the tab. I finished my shift. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for 40 minutes without going inside. Then I ordered my own full ancestry kit. I told myself I just wanted to verify. A system error. A database glitch. These things happened. I had heard of cases where the relative matching algorithm produced false positives, especially with partial samples or processing anomalies. There was a completely reasonable explanation. I waited 5 weeks. The results came back on a Friday morning. I read them on my phone, sitting on the edge of my bathtub with Biscuit walking across my feet, which was his way of telling me he wanted breakfast. The match was not a glitch. The database confirmed a first-degree maternal relative connection between me and Tommy's mother, meaning she and I shared a parent. And there was more. The expanded results, which I had paid extra for without really knowing why, flagged additional close matches, 2 women identified as probable first-degree relatives, both in their 50s, both with last names I didn't recognize. One of them had a small photo attached to her profile. Brown hair, lighter than mine, blue eyes, a smile that looked like a question. She looked like me. I stared at that photo for a long time. Not because I was certain, because I was beginning to understand that certainty was going to require me to do something I had been trained my entire life not to do, which was to demand an answer from Roberta. I didn't call ahead. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning in April, which was 2 weeks after the results came back, because I'd spent those 2 weeks trying to find another explanation and running out of roads. I had done some research, enough to know that the woman in the photo, whose name was Gwendolyn, according to her public profile, had posted on the Ancestry forum about searching for a child her younger sister had given birth to in 1995. A child who had been placed in the care of a family friend and then seemingly disappeared from all official records. Roberta opened the door in her housecoat and looked at me the way she always looked at me, like I was something that required management. I said, "I need to talk to you about where I actually came from." The thing about a careful woman is that she knows when she's been caught. She doesn't crumble. She doesn't cry. What Roberta did was take one slow breath through her nose, step back from the door, and say, "I suppose you'd better come in." She made coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her mug, and she told me my mother, my real mother, was a woman named Suzanne. She and Roberta had been friends in their 20s, not sisters. They had worked together at the same insurance company in Wichita. When Suzanne got pregnant at 22, unmarried, and was diagnosed with early-stage lupus in the same year, she had panicked. She wasn't sure she could raise a child alone while managing a chronic illness. She trusted Roberta. She asked Roberta to the baby temporarily, just for a few months, just while she stabilized. Roberta took the baby, and then Roberta told Suzanne that the baby had died. She told her this over the phone. She never gave Suzanne a body to bury. She said there had been a sudden illness, that it had happened fast, that the hospital had handled everything. She told me this at her kitchen table while her coffee went cold in the flat deliberate tone of someone recounting a logistics problem they had solved a long time ago. I didn't say anything for a while. "Why?" I finally said, not shouting, just the word. She looked at her mug. "You was such an easy baby," she said, which was not an answer, and we both knew it. There was money. There's almost always money. Suzanne had a small trust that her own parents had set up, meant to cover childcare and educational expenses for any children she had. When Roberta became my legal guardian through paperwork that, she admitted quietly, had involved a notary she no longer kept in contact with, she also became the administrator of that trust. About $40,000 over the course of my childhood, disbursed in increments small enough not to trigger automatic audits. My college, she told me, she had paid for herself, as though this was something I should acknowledge. "You lied to a woman that her baby was dead," I said. "It was complicated," she said. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." She didn't. She sat there in her housecoat and looked at the window, and I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that she was not going to give me anything more than the minimum. She had managed the situation for 28 years. She saw no reason to stop now. I left her house without finishing my coffee. I sat in my car again. Different parking lot this time. Same feeling of the ground being somewhere I couldn't locate. I had a mother who thought I was dead. I drove home and I called the Ancestry platform's customer support line and I asked them how to send a message through their relative matching system to a connected profile. The customer service rep walked me through it. Her name was probably something cheerful. I don't remember. I wrote a message to the woman named Gwendolyn, the one with the brown hair and the questioning smile, and I told her I thought I might be connected to her sister Suzanne. I told her I needed to find out if Suzanne was still alive. I told her I was sorry if I was wrong. She replied in 4 hours, which, for a stranger receiving a message like that, is essentially instantaneous. She was not a stranger by the end of that message. Gwendolyn told me that Suzanne was alive. She told me that Suzanne had spent years trying to find some record of what had happened, a death certificate, a hospital report, something, and had found nothing, which she had been told was a clerical issue, which she had eventually been persuaded to accept because the alternative was too painful. She told me that Suzanne was 61, that she lived in Charlotte, that she had never married, that she had never had other children, that she had a small garden she tended with tremendous seriousness and 2 dogs that slept in her bed. She told me that Suzanne talked about me, not by my name, because she hadn't known my name, but she talked about the baby, past tense, because she thought. I had to stop reading for a minute. Gwendolyn and I exchanged phone numbers. She called me that same evening. Her voice was the kind of voice that makes you feel like you could tell the truth in it. We talked for 2 hours. She cried twice. I cried once, in the bathroom with the door closed, and then came back and pretended I hadn't. She asked if I wanted to meet Suzanne. I said I needed a week to think. I took 5 days. In those 5 days, I went to work, I took care of Tommy and the other kids and the ordinary machinery of my job. I cleaned my apartment twice. I called my best friend and told her everything, and I sat with what I was about to do. Because meeting someone who thought you were dead for 28 years is not a small thing. It's not a reunion. It's a reckoning for both people, and I didn't know if I was ready for what she might feel when she looked at me, whether it would be joy or grief or both at once, whether seeing me would give her something back or just reopen everything she tried to close. My friend, who has known me for 11 years and is usually pretty sparing with advice, said, "Audrey, go." I flew to Charlotte on a Thursday morning in May. Gwendolyn picked me up from the airport. She was small and quick-moving and had the same eyes I saw in my mirror. And when she hugged me in the arrivals area, which I had not expected, I stood there with my arms a little stiff for a moment before I figured out how to hug her back. She held on long enough for it to become real. She drove me to a neighborhood with older houses and big trees, hydrangeas in the front yard of the one we pulled up to. A porch with two wooden chairs that had weathered into silver. Suzanne was waiting on that porch. She was smaller than I'd imagined, 61 years old, silver hair cut short, wearing a green cardigan that looked like it had been washed about 400 times. She stood up when she saw me get out of the car. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been trying to remember the shape of. Then she said, "You have your grandmother's hands." I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about my grandmother. I looked down at my hands, the hands I'd had my whole life, long fingers, the kind I'd always thought looked too big for my wrists, and something happened in my chest that I don't entirely have words for. She walked down the porch steps and she hugged me and she said something in my ear, very quietly, just 4 words. She said, "I never stopped looking." I have thought about those words every day since, not because they were dramatic, they weren't, the way she said them. She said them the way you say something that's simply exactly true. She never stopped looking. For years, with nothing to find, up against official-sounding silences and dead ends, she had never fully let herself believe what she'd been told. She said she had tried to. She said there were whole years where she made herself accept it. But some part of her had kept a small door open, just in case. I stayed in Charlotte for 4 days. We sat on her porch, and she told me about her life. Her illness, which had gone into long remission and was now managed, her garden, which was exactly as serious as Gwendolyn had described, her dogs, both of whom decided I was acceptable by the end of day 1. She told me about her parents, my grandparents, who had both passed, her mother in 2018. She told me there were cousins and an uncle in Phoenix, and a whole geography of people I had never known existed. She didn't ask me to forgive Roberta. She didn't say much about Roberta at all, actually, except once, on the last evening, when she said, "I hope she knows what she took from both of us, not with anger, with something quieter and more final than anger." I consulted with an attorney when I got back to Tulsa. It's complicated, legally. Roberta's actions, the fraudulent guardianship paperwork, the misappropriation of the trust funds, the deliberate false report of a death, involve multiple potential claims across state lines, and the statute of limitations on some of it is murky. The attorney was honest with me. Some of it may not be actionable this many years later. Some of it might be. We're still in the process of figuring out what accountability looks like, and I'm trying to be realistic about what legal systems can and can't return to you. What I know for certain is this. Roberta administered approximately $42,000 in trust funds that were meant for me over the course of my childhood and adolescence without my knowledge or Suzanne's. That part is documented. That part is being reviewed. I haven't spoken to Roberta since the day I left her kitchen. She has texted me twice, brief, careful texts that don't quite apologize for anything specific. I haven't responded. I talk to Suzanne on the phone every Sunday. We've settled into it with a naturalness that surprised me. She asks about my patients, the kids especially, and I tell her about Tommy, who is doing better, whose mother knows me now in a way she didn't before, though I haven't told Tommy any of this because he's 8 and some things can wait. Suzanne tells me about her garden. Last week a rabbit got into the kale and she had strong feelings about it that she shared with me in some detail. It sounds like a small thing, those phone calls. A grown woman and her mother talking on Sundays about rabbits in the garden and difficult patients and what they've been reading. But I spent 28 years learning to take up as little space as possible. Learning that I was, at best, a circumstance someone else had to manage. Suzanne doesn't manage me. She just talks to me, like I'm a person she wanted to know. This summer, I'm going back to Charlotte. Gwendolyn is throwing a small thing. She called it a gathering, not a party, because she said party felt like the wrong register and there will be cousins I haven't met, and the uncle from Phoenix is flying in, and Suzanne is making her grandmother's recipe for pecan pie, which apparently is not optional. I bought my plane ticket the same day she told me. I have my grandmother's hands. I know that now. And somewhere in Charlotte, there are people who have been keeping a small door open just in case for longer than I understood was possible. I'm walking through it. I've been thinking a lot about what it actually costs to lie to someone for 28 years. Not the legal cost. That's still being sorted out, and I've made my peace with the uncertainty of what accountability will look like in the end. I mean the human cost. What it requires of a person to maintain something like that across decades, through birthday cakes and school plays and ordinary Tuesday dinners, and to keep their face still the whole time. Roberta was not a cruel woman in the dramatic sense. She never hit me. She ped me. She kept the heat on. By any checklist of minimum requirements, she did what was necessary. But there is a particular kind of damage that comes not from what people do to you, but from what they withhold. Truth, warmth, the simple knowledge that someone chose you rather than inherited you as a problem to manage. I spent 29 years not knowing I was missing those things. I just knew something felt thin. I just knew I apologized for existing in ways my friends didn't seem to. That's what a sustained lie does to a child. It doesn't leave marks you can point to. It leaves a posture, a habit of smallness, a reflex that says, take up less space, ask for less, expect less, because you are at best someone else's inconvenience. Roberta made a choice in 1995 that she probably told herself was practical. Maybe she even told herself it was kind, that Suzanne was sick, that the baby would be better off, that it was all very complicated. People who do harmful things rarely experience themselves as villains. They experience themselves as villains. They experience themselves as people making difficult decisions under difficult circumstances. The story they tell themselves is always reasonable. That's what makes it possible to keep going. But choices compound. That's the thing nobody tells you clearly enough. The first lie required a second one, and the second required a structure to support it, and the structure required years of maintenance, and somewhere in all that maintenance, a little girl grew up believing she was a burden, because the alternative, the truth, would have cost Roberta something she wasn't willing to pay. And Suzanne. Suzanne spent 28 years with a wound that couldn't fully close because she never had anything real to grieve. She was told her daughter died and given nothing to hold. No record, no ceremony, just a phone call and then silence. She spent years trying to find a death certificate that didn't exist for a child who was alive and eating cereal in Tulsa, 30 minutes from where Roberta and Suzanne had once worked at the same desk. What I keep coming back to is that Suzanne didn't give up. Not completely. She couldn't prove anything. She had no leads, no evidence, nothing but a feeling she couldn't quite rationalize away. She kept a door open that she had every reason to close. That takes something. Not stubbornness exactly, more like integrity toward your own grief. A refusal to accept an explanation that never fully fit, even when accepting it would have been easier. I think about that when I'm tempted to let something go that I shouldn't. When it's easier to take someone's word for it than to ask the question that makes the room uncomfortable. Suzanne's small, persistent doubt, the one she'd probably spend years being embarrassed by, turned out to be the most accurate thing she had. I have my grandmother's hands. I didn't know that for 28 years. There's a whole geography of people I belong to that I'm only now beginning to learn. That's time I won't get back. And I try not to sit with that too long because it doesn't go anywhere useful. What I know is this: I am not a burden. I never was. I was just a child handed to someone who needed to believe she was doing the world a favor. I fly back to Charlotte next month. Suzanne is making pecan pie. I'm not going to be late.